All right, everybody, we're going to be taking some notes on properties. So go to your table of contents. In your table of contents, put today's date. What is today's date? It is 9/20. All right, put down today's date, 9/20/18. The title is Properties. And whatever page number you happen to be on. Now, throughout this video, if you need to pause at any moment to catch up, go ahead and pause the video. Right now, fill out your table of contents, 9/20/18, properties, and whatever page number you're on, go to that page, and let's write about some properties. All right, at the top of the page that you're on, write down properties for the title. Now, when I say properties, I mean things that are true. For example, why is it that when you've got a metal pan on the stove and you've been heating something and you touch the metal handle, it's hot? Why? The handle wasn't the part that was near the flame, but it's still hot. That's because a property of metal is that it conducts heat. So a property is something that's true about something. So again, a property of metal, something that's true about it, it conducts heat. These are going to be properties of numbers. What are true about numbers? And there's lots of different properties. The first property is the commutative property. Commutative property. The commutative property works for adding and multiplying, but not for dividing or subtracting. And it goes like this. A plus B is equal to B plus A. Or A times B is equal to B times A. So basically, you could add or multiply two numbers, change their order, and it doesn't really make a difference. They're still going to be equivalent, whether you multiply them in this order or that order. All right, an example of how we apply this might be this problem right here. I'm going to write down this problem. Try to solve this problem using mental math. All right, 54 plus 19 plus 16. Using mental math only, see if you can solve that problem. Pause the video if you need to for a minute. And I believe the answer is 89. Now the way I came up with it is this. I did 54 plus 16 first, because that ends in a 0, which makes things easier. So that equals 70. After that 70, then I added the 19. And that got me to 89. So what I did is I changed the order of these numbers, the 19 and the 16. I switched the order there to make it easier. What allowed me to switch the order? The commutative property. All right, next property coming up. It is the associative property. The associative property, once again, works for adding and multiplying, but not for dividing or subtracting. The associative property works when you have three numbers. We're going to call them A, B, and C. And if you notice, the numbers do not change order. We've got A plus B plus C is equal to A plus B plus C. What is going to change is the grouping of these numbers. You could add the A and the B first, and then add the C. Or you could add the B and the C first, then add the A. So the grouping changes. That's the associative property. And again, it works for multiplying as well. A times B and then times C is equivalent to A times the quantity of B times C. You could multiply the B and C first, then the A, or the A and the B, and then the C. So the numbers do not change order, but the grouping changes. Try to solve this next problem mentally. Let's see, we're going to do 13 times 5 times 20. Okay, so you could solve 13 times 5 times 20 mentally. Pause the video if you need a second. And I got 1,300 for my answer. And the way that I got my answer was this. I did 5 times 20 first because I knew that gives me an even 100. So then it's really just 13 times 100. So what allows me to do the 5 times 20 first instead of the 13 times 5 first? It is the associative property. There we go. All right, next property coming at you in a second. Again, if you missed any of these, go back and pause the video so you can catch up on whatever notes you missed. Pause the video at any time to get these notes copied down. All right, next property is going to be the identity property. There's an identity property of addition, and then kind of a different one for multiplication. All right, identity property of addition. Let's say we have a number A. We want to add something to it, but we want the answer to still be A. We want it to not change its identity. Its identity will stay the same. What is the only number that you can add to A to make it stay just A? And that is 0. Identity property of addition is when you add 0 to any number, it'll stay the same. Now what about if you have multiplication? There is one number I can multiply by A and have it stay A, and it's not 0. What is the number that you would multiply by A and it just stays A? That is 1. So A times 1 equals A. We're going to come back with an example later on that kind of illustrates this, but right now it's pretty obvious. You add 0 to any number, stays the same. You multiply any number by 1, it stays the same. That is the identity property. All right, next property coming at you. And let's see here, we got identity property. Let's do the 0 property of multiplication. Okay, 0 property of multiplication. Now we just said if you add 0 to any number, it stays the same. So that's called the identity property. But what happens to a number if you multiply it by 0? Does it stay the same? Does it stay A? It does not stay A. It changes to 0. So any number being multiplied by 0 will just turn into 0 as the answer. So that is the 0 property of multiplication, not to be confused with the identity property where you add 0 and the number stays the same. All right, next property coming at you is the additive inverse property. Additive inverse property. All right, it says if you have any number and you want to add something to it, but you want the answer to be 0, what is the only number that you could add to A where the answer is going to be 0? The answer is negative A. A plus negative A equals 0. So any number plus its opposite is equal to 0. So if you have 17, you want to add something to it and make it equal 0, you add negative 17 to it. You add its opposite. Now, additive inverse is kind of like an adjective naming the property. Like what property? The additive inverse property. But it's also a noun. Like what is the additive inverse of 17? The additive inverse is negative 17. So additive inverse is basically a way to say opposite. An additive inverse is just an opposite. When you add any number to its opposite, it'll be 0. So what is the additive inverse of negative 8.2? In other words, what is the opposite of negative 8.2? It is positive 8.2. What happens if I add these together? Then the answer is 0. And that is the additive inverse property. Next, the multiplicative inverse property. That's a C and an A right there. Multiplicative inverse property. It's a little bit difficult to say. Multiplicative inverse property. Multiplicative inverse property. Now, a multiplicative inverse, again, is kind of like an adjective. Like what property? The multiplicative inverse property. But it's also like a noun. A multiplicative inverse is otherwise known as a reciprocal. All right, you should already remember what reciprocals are. What is the reciprocal of A over B? It is B over A. They're not opposites of each other, they're just reciprocals. Or you could say they're multiplicative inverses of each other. The thing at school is when you multiply these, it will always equal just one whole. If you don't believe me, let's try it with some numbers. Let's say the A and the B is actually like a 3 and a 4. What is the reciprocal of 3 over 4? It is 4 over 3. And I'm saying when you multiply these, you're going to get 1. And if you don't believe me, try it. What is 3 times 4? 12. What's 4 times 3? 12. So it equals 12 over 12, and 12 over 12 is 1. And that'll work with any numbers. So a reciprocal is otherwise known as a multiplicative inverse. When you multiply multiplicative inverses, the answer will always be 1. All right. Next property. Distributive property. It works in a problem like this. A times the quantity of b plus c, or a times the quantity of b minus c. Now, the distributive property is often confused with the associative property, because if you go back and look at what we wrote for associative property, it also has 3 numbers that we called a, b, and c. The associative property works for adding and for multiplying. Now, the difference is this. Here's the key difference. In the associative property, if you look at the a, b, and c, all 3 of those are being added, or all 3 of those are being multiplied. However, in this property, there's multiplying here, a multiplied by, and then there's adding here, b plus c, or subtracting. So there's multiplication and addition in the same problem, or multiplying and subtracting in the same problem. All right, so what you could do is this. A times the quantity of b plus c is the same thing as a times b plus a times c. A times b minus c is the same thing as a times b minus a times c. And that is the distributive property. All right, so to see that in action, you might have to solve a problem like this. Let's say we're doing 8 multiplied by, we'll make it 5 and 1/4. What is the answer to 8 times 5 and 1/4? Now, you could put 8 over 1, and you can make this an improper fraction, make this 21 over 4, and you could do it that way. 8 over 1 times 21 over 4, and continue to do that problem. However, you could also think about it like this. 5 and 1/4 is actually like 5 plus a 4th. So I'm not changing this problem when I do it like this. However, notice now it's in this form where we're multiplying this number, and we're adding these 2 numbers. So I could do this. What is 8 times 5? That is 40. Plus, what is 8 times 1/4? That's a 4th of 8. A 4th of 8 is 2. So it's really 40 plus 2. 40 plus 2 is 42. So that was using the distributive property. All right, and one last thing. Let's take a look at a problem like this. See if you can solve this using mental math. All right, the problem is 5/3 times by -2/7 times by 3/5. All right, can you solve this problem using mental math? It's actually way easier than it looks. Pause the video if you need a second. And if you think the answer is -2/7, you're right. So let me show you one thing you could do. One thing you do is change the order of these problems, or change the order of the numbers in this problem. So notice I changed the order. I put this right there, and I put this right there. What property lets me do that? It is the commutative property. Now what I could do is I could decide, you know what, I'm going to do this part of the problem first, and I'm going to save that for later. What part of the property, or what property lets me group that together first? That's the associative property. Now, when I have 5 over 3 times 3 over 5, I realize that they are reciprocals of one another, and I know automatically that equals 1 whole. If you didn't know that automatically, you would get 15 over 15, which is still 1 whole. So what property tells me that 5 over 3 times 3 over 5 is 1 whole? That is the multiplicative inverse property. And now I know that if I take 1 whole and times it by -2/7, it's just going to stay at -2/7. What property says if I do 1 times -2/7, it just stays the same thing? That is the identity property. So this one problem that looks complicated, but really it's super easy, is actually using a lot of different properties. It's using the commutative property, it's using the associative property, it's using the multiplicative inverse property, and the identity property, where you could solve this problem using mental math in just a couple seconds. So there you have it. Those are all the properties in your notes. Now you're going to apply them to your Canvas modules.